Hey guys, what's going on? Blade back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about The Power of the Dog. The Power of the Dog is an American Western drama based on the novel of the same name, and tells the story of a rancher named Phil Burbank. He runs his ranch with his brother George, and the two make a wealthy living in doing so, but he also has an intimidating personality that inspires fear and submission to those around him. Tired of his ongoing cruelty, George takes to a woman in his community named Rose while doing a routine cattle drive, eventually marrying her and bringing Rose and her son Peter to live with him at the ranch. This upsets Phil to the point that he begins to torment Rose while also developing a bond with her son at the same time. I have to admit that I didn't quite get this movie at first when I was watching it. It had tons of critical praise heaped on it before it was even released on Netflix, so I had sky-high expectations going into it, only to end up slightly disappointed in the first few chapters of the story. However, once it got to the halfway point, that's when the movie really began to kick off. It's one of those slow burn types of dramas that can take a long time to get going, but once it does, it sucks you in and makes you appreciate all the little details that make it so worthwhile. Benedict Cumberbatch's performance as Phil Burbank was my favorite element of the movie by far. He completely owns the role of a repulsive scumbag, both figuratively and literally. He regularly bullies George, Rose, and Peter, among others, to suit his own amusement, while living in squalor and filth despite his affluence. This wretched way of living can be attributed to him being influenced by a mentor figure he used to follow in the form of Bronco Henry, who he reveres in an almost godlike manner. We never get a full picture of what the relationship was like between him and Henry, but little hints here and there give enough clues to point out that he was important to him. And ultimately, there is a reason that's given regarding Phil's behavior, which I'll talk a bit about later without any spoilers. For now, all I'll say is that the mentor-mentee relationship that develops between him and Peter is clearly inspired from this background. Phil wants to regain what he lost from Henry and thinks Peter is perfect for filling that void. There's a deep sense of loneliness that's conveyed perfectly in the story. He's always reminiscing about what happened in the past, whether about the good old days with Henry or on vacations with his brother George as a child. Even though he acts deplorable, you almost feel bad for him due to the seemingly good upbringing he had, and when a movie makes you feel sympathy for a villain, that in itself is an accomplishment. His brother George, played by Jesse Plemons, was another character I felt sympathy for as well. He is a total black sheep who doesn't fit in with Phil's rowdy crew of cowhands, made even worse by Phil's verbal abuse toward him. I instantly felt sorry for him, knowing that he carried the weight of several years of abuse on his shoulders. It's only when he's able to find love in his wife Rose that he's finally able to let go of his loneliness. The fact that he's nervous at the idea of doing a simple dance with her communicates just how deeply affected he was by his brother, which made it a relief to see him enjoy something normal for once in his life. I think Jesse Plemons did a fantastic job with his character and communicating the pain that he undergoes, although I'm a bit disappointed with how underused he is. Once he has his moment with Rose, it feels like his character arc just stops and only makes sporadic appearances in the rest of the movie. It still feels complete, but it would have been nice to see more of it nonetheless. Kirsten Dunst was excellent as Rose too. She's caught between a rock and a hard place in that she loves and appreciates George, but cannot stand even being in Phil's presence without getting a migraine. The abuse she receives at the hands of Phil becomes more psychological in nature, and this is where the movie really starts to get interesting. With Peter gone to medical school for a while and George away at work constantly, Rose is left alone to deal with Phil's behavior, and she becomes such a wreck that she has to cope by drinking. I didn't like this aspect of her character at first, as I thought she turned to alcoholism a little too quickly. However, I had to step back and realize that not everyone reacts to abuse the same way. Some, like George, can just take it and bottle it up, while others like Rose have to drink in order to deal with it. This makes more sense when her son Peter reveals later on that his own father used to drink excessively before he died. Knowing this painted Rose in a different light for me, and it hurt to see her character suffer so much, not just from what Phil did, but also with what she did to herself. It goes to show how deep the cycle of abuse can run in families and how much they can be affected by it. Peter is especially affected by this due to his artistic interests, slim figure, and effeminate behavior. Despite this, however, Phil sees an opportunity to teach Peter in the same way Bronco Henry did for him, which runs the risk of perpetuating the cycle of abuse all over again. And without getting too much into spoiler territory, I like how the dynamics of their relationship played out. Peter is a very smart character who knows what Phil is up to, and he starts employing his own psychological tactics against him. I didn't even realize the movie movie was essentially one big mind game until it was almost over. And in my opinion, that's what makes the movie so great. There's so many little details happening in the background and even the foreground of the story, but even though I noticed them, I never truly knew what was going on until the finale happened. And I love how this mystery element kept me on my toes even when the answer was right in front of me. Every single scene in this movie has a foreboding atmosphere that makes one feel uneasy when watching it, and I say that in a good way. The soundtrack has violins and other string instruments playing in discordance with each other, which emphasizes the tension that these characters are experiencing. Excellent cinematography assists with conveying this tension as well. All of these characters live in the rural wilderness of Montana with rolling hills and jagged mountains isolating the characters from any hint of civilization, which forces them to become self-reliant in coping with their struggles. There's all kinds of messages and thematic material that can be pulled out of the movie. The biggest one that I noticed, and I might be off base on this, is how Phil seems to force an overly masculine version of himself to compensate for who he truly is. Western movies are generally known for their presentation of strong, gritty male characters forged from their harsh environments, and this movie feels like a reinvention or even a critique of that stereotype. Phil acts overly abrasive and dominant toward others, especially to those like Peter who are quote-unquote not real men, which could be perceived as him trying to cover his own insecurities. There's an almost animalistic quality to his character and how he's trying to display dominance over others, which is appropriate because he acts like an animal too, with how he intentionally covers himself in mud before bathing and embracing the stink that comes from his ranch work, going so far as to say that he likes it. This could be a way of him saying that he's trying to protect himself from anyone who he feels threatened by, or it could simply be to mask his true identity. Any way you choose to interpret it, there is a ton of depth to his character that explains why he's abusive without condoning his actions. Honestly, I could talk all day about how magnificent this movie is, but that video would go on for a pretty long time. There aren't many complaints I can think of beyond minor nitpicks, like how this movie is supposed to take place in Montana, yet it clearly doesn't. Maybe some of it does, but it's so obvious that most of it was filmed in New Zealand once you see the landscape shots with its mountains everywhere. Also, and I already said this, but the movie moves at a very slow pace. There's nothing in the way of violence aside from a cattle castration scene which I had to turn away from, but other than that, nothing brutal ever happens to the characters, and for a Western movie that can be disconcerting. And I'm not saying that to knock the movie either. Like I said, the movie is very much an anti-Western that turns the trope of overly masculine characters on their heads. If you plan to watch this movie, just know that it takes a while to sink its fangs in, but once it does, man is it worth it. Overall, The Power of the Dog definitely lives up to the hype, at least in my opinion. It's a multi-layered drama that explores the cycle of abuse and how it pervades families in multiple forms while exploring what it really means to be a cowboy. If you enjoy Westerns and want to see something that's completely different in the best way possible, as long as you don't mind slow pacing, this is the one to see. This movie took some time for me to digest before I could fully appreciate it, and I'm glad I took the time in doing so. Jane Campion directed a powerful story and a cautionary tale of a toxic male character combined with beautiful visuals, a haunting soundtrack, and excellent performances. I would love to see Westerns make a comeback, and if they do, they have an excellent example to follow. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of The Power of the Dog. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the American holiday rom-com, Single All the Way. Bye bye!